everybody. Thanks for making it today. I know that there's lots of challenges that people had with the storm last night, so it's great to see so many people here today. We're very happy to have presenting at our CID speaker series, our final one of the year, Isaac Martin. He is the Jeri-Ann and Gary E. Jacobs Professor of Social Science in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the University of California, San Diego. He is the author of many books and articles on topics related to housing policy, municipal taxation, and the political economy of inequality, which is very much up the alley of the research interests of many of us at CID. His books include Foreclosed America, Rich People's Movements, The Permanent Tax Revolt, and he's editor of the New Handbook of Political Sociology and the New Fiscal Sociology. So if you ever hear anything about the New Fiscal Sociology, you can thank Isaac. So today he's going to be giving a talk on the taxes we vote for. It'll be sociology rules, so please hold your questions until the end, and we'll pass the mic around for questions. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Isaac.
Happy Tax Day to all those who celebrate. And thank you for having me. So the United States collects more tax revenue than most countries on planet Earth, but collects less as a share of income than most other comparably developed economies. And it is in that sense that the US is a low tax country. The question of why the US is a low tax country has preoccupied a lot of comparative political sociologists and political scientists for a lot of reasons. One of them is that it's thought to bear on the question of inequality. Taxation, of course, underwriting not only the social safety net and social spending and transfer spending, but also simply public sector employment, which is comparatively an equalizing force in market economies. And indeed, we see here a comparison from approximately 2022 data from OECD revenue statistics and OECD income distribution data. Indeed, the share of GDP collected in taxes is negatively correlated with income, household disposable income inequality. So the comparatively low taxation of the United States is thought to be important for that reason. It might also be important in part because taxation is thought to protect countries against the risk of authoritarianism. And this is actually from, I've taken this graph directly from a paper that Vanessa Williamson published in Foreign Affairs just a couple weeks ago. One simple way to demonstrate the correlation, but it's an association that's been found with a variety of measures of democracy or representation in a variety of different data sets. And the basic intuition here is that taxation creates demands for accountability, and the need for tax revenues creates an incentive for rulers to concede some demands for accountability in how they use funding. And for this reason, your garden variety tyrant might prefer instead other revenue sources like plunder or taking oil out of the ground and selling it on world markets. So the fact that the United States is a comparatively low tax country is potentially an important one. And the question of why it is a comparatively low tax country has then drawn a lot of attention. And as with any question about why the US politically is distinctively this way or that way, we can round up the list of usual suspects, all of which are represented in the literature. Maybe the answer is that people in the United States adhere to a particularly individualistic ideology. There's a lot of good support for this in comparative public opinion data. That could be part of the explanation for why people are comparatively reluctant to contribute to public goods. Or maybe it's that they're especially unwilling to contribute to public goods that they believe will be spent for the benefit of racially stigmatized others. This is sort of the Alesina and Glaser argument, where they argue that in-group prejudice in ethnically divided societies leads to reduced spending on public goods, or perhaps, as Andrea Campbell has argued in her new book, Taxation and Resentment, it's not just sort of prejudice against outgroups, it's really specific stereotypes of African American and Hispanic people that motivate reluctance to contribute to the public sector. Or maybe it's certain institutional legacies of chattel slavery. We can point here in the tax literature to Article 1, Section 9 of the United States Constitution, which contains the direct tax clause, which says that no direct tax can be levied except in proportion to the census. Nobody knew at the time they wrote that apparently exactly what a direct tax was. But the record is pretty clear that people wrote that into the Constitution in order to prevent abolitionists from taxing enslavers out of business. And that then became a barrier to enactment of an income tax. That's the reason we had to amend the federal Constitution to permit federal taxation of personal income. And it might again become a barrier if a court as conservative as the present Supreme Court ever had to hear the question of a wealth tax. Or we might point to federalism, which delegates fiscal authority to state governments, and state governments then delegate a lot of fiscal authority to local governments, and that sets up a system where you have lots of little governments competing with one another to attract people and private investment, and that creates a race to the bottom in tax rates. Or it might be the position of the United States in the world system. The privilege in particular since the Bretton Woods Conference that was enjoyed for so many decades of being the world's reserve currency and therefore being able to borrow at comparatively advantageous rates might make it easier to get away without raising as much tax. All of these explanations might be part of the puzzle, and they're all kind of represented in the comparative literature, but maybe there's also something about the tax system itself that conduces to people's unwillingness to stump up and pay for more public goods. This has been kind of a line of inquiry that's been pursued in this interdisciplinary field since the 1990s. There was a moment in the early 90s where there was a kind of interdisciplinary convergence. Sven Steinmo in political science and Elliot Brownlee in history, and to some degree John Campbell in sociology all sort of took a look at the United States and said, well, maybe there's something particular going on here. And in particular, the reliance of, comparatively heavy reliance of the United States on income and property taxes might be part of the story. The United States has no national value-added tax. It does rely comparatively heavily on income taxes and property taxes, and maybe those taxes have a particular set of features that make them especially politically contentious or especially politically unpopular, or make it especially difficult for the United States to raise a lot of revenue that way. That idea really begins and sort of takes off with the work of Harold Walensky, a political scientist and sociologist who made this argument first in the 1970s and repeated it in the early 2000s with a comparative study of what he called tax welfare backlash. Walensky's version of the argument was that the problem with income and property taxes, the thing that made them so politically unpopular, was that they were painfully visible taxes compared to other kinds of taxes. You scratch a little bit on what that means, and it seems to me to be a way of saying that the income and property taxes are politically salient and unpopular because they're the kind of taxes that are politically salient and unpopular. The literature, thankfully, has moved on a bit, and there have been a lot of other really interesting studies that have tried to tease out more specifically what it is about these taxes that might make them unpopular. We have, for example, the idea that maybe it's because the income tax is comparatively progressive, and the associated idea that there are also, in part, associated with the comparatively progressive rate structure, there are lots of tax deductions and tax expenditures that disproportionately benefit high-income people. Those two things together make it unpopular with high-income people and low-income people, and that makes it unpopular with everybody. This is a version of the argument that Andrea Campbell made last year in Taxation and Resentment. Maybe it's the fact that the income tax is self-assessed. This is comparatively unusual. So the idea that we actually have a tax day where not only tax returns are due, but that we have to fill out those tax returns ourselves or pay somebody to do it is a comparatively unusual mode of income taxation. And Ruth Brownstein, among others, has argued that this ritual of self-assessment actually kind of has some qualities that, first of all, make the federal income tax especially salient, and second of all, draw our attentions to things about taxation that we especially dislike, such as all the tax breaks that other people get. Or maybe it's the fact that it's collected directly in the sense that we as taxpayers directly interact with the taxing authorities, particularly with property tax, but also if we owe income tax directly with the federal government, the IRS, around income taxation. Monica Prasad has made a version of this argument in several of her publications, the idea that direct taxation, again, sort of makes taxation especially politically salient. That's a classical argument, but revived recently. Maybe it's the fact that these are general taxes that just go into the general budget. They're not earmarked for anything, and so we're kind of free to make our worst imaginings about where the money goes. This Vanessa Williamson has made this argument in a few of her pieces about the income tax. And everybody who has studied this also agrees that there's an exception to the unpopularity of taxation in the United States, and that's the Social Security payroll tax. FDR famously told Luther Gulick, at least according to Luther Gulick, that with those taxes in there, no damn politician can get rid of my Social Security system. So FDR attributed the popularity of Social Security in part to, or the durability, political durability of Social Security in part to the payroll tax. Is that because it's invisible? That was Walensky's version. Is it because it was called a contribution rather than a tax? Theda Skocpol made that argument in print at least once. Is it because it's associated symbolically with work? Brian Steensland has speculated that that's what the issue is. Is it that it's withheld from paychecks or nominally split with employers so that people don't understand the incidence and don't understand how much tax they're actually liable for and how much of the burden they actually bear? Edward McCaffrey, among others, has made this argument. Or is that it's earmarked for favored groups of people, right? People stereotyped as worthy or deserving. All of these are plausible hypotheses in the literature. And the trouble is we've got a lot of different independent variables here, and we've got two cases, an income tax and a payroll tax. What if we could compare hundreds of other taxes too? Welcome to California. California, in fact, does have hundreds and hundreds of other taxes that have been put directly before voters. Ever since 1978, when a constitutional amendment called Proposition 13 wrote into the state constitution the requirement that any special tax levied by a local government needs to go to the voters and needs a vote of a 2/3 majority, we have had to vote on lots of things at the local level in California. Now, one of the things that constitutional amendment did was unleash decades of litigation about what on earth special tax means, because it was vaguely written. That ended up getting clarified by later ballot initiatives. In 1986, a statute called Proposition 62 clarified that the distinction was a special tax was an earmarked tax, a general tax was one that went into the general budget, and a general tax also needs to go to the voters now and needs a simple majority approval. In 1996, another amendment to the state constitution clarified some ambiguities in that law, cleaned up some things that the courts had sort of taken different positions on, and made it so that there are now basically no exceptions. So anytime any local government in California wants to increase any rate of tax on anyone for any purpose, it goes to a vote of the people. That means, on average, we have about 135 local tax measures somewhere in the state in a given year. And most of those occasions, most of the Californians vote yes. This graph represents the percentage of voters voting yes in the average tax measure and the percentage of measures getting approved. Those things, of course, don't totally move in parallel because some of these tax measures require supermajorities. And this tracks it over time. This is data from the California Secretary of State California Election Data Archive from 1995. I am certain that these data are incomplete. There are some tax measures that didn't make it onto the Secretary of State's list. But I am certain also that this is the pattern. The great majority of these measures pass. And perhaps more importantly for my purposes, there's a lot of variation. Some taxes are more popular than others. And some are way more popular than others, including different taxes levied in the same place. The time trend, you'll also notice the time trend here, a movement towards increasing percentages saying yes or increasing percentages of measures that pass. That could be because of changes over time in public opinion toward taxation. It could be just because local governments got much more sophisticated about assessing which measures were likely to pass. And so there's clearly some very careful kind of attention to putting stuff on the ballot only if elected officials think that it is likely to hit the threshold for approval. Nevertheless, the overall pattern is clear and is interesting and includes a lot of variation we can exploit. Now, I can't come here and tell you that Californians are representative of any larger population. We're not. But I think we're also not as different from everybody else as the kind of stereotypes we all get from the mass media might lead us to expect. California, of course, being the center of the entertainment industry, the Californians we see most in the media are people who are professionals at attracting attention to themselves. But if you look sort of on average, the tax attitudes of a typical Californian are pretty much the same as the tax attitudes of a typical other US adult. The national survey data show, very, very similar opinion on these very broad questions. Although California is not sort of average or typical of the United States, it includes a lot of variation that encompasses a wide range of other situations. So for example, here I just wanted to show GDP per capita, 2022, in current thousands of dollars. And compare California counties, those are the blue bars, with selected OECD countries, which are the orange bars, to make the point that we have California counties here that are very, very rich. We've got San Francisco there at the top, and we've got, I think that's Marin County next to it, higher income per capita than Luxembourg. And then way down at the bottom, we have Trinity County, lower per capita GDP than Greece. And we span the entire range in between. Ethnic fractionalization, this is a conventional measure of sort of ethno-racial heterogeneity or diversity. It is the measure that Alesina and Glaser used in their classic study of heterogeneity or diversity in public goods provision. And I just wanted to, again, show you how California counties look in comparison to selected OECD countries. Again, to make the point that we have some California counties that are more diverse than Canada. We've got one that's more diverse than Canada there, and we've got some that are almost as homogeneous as Greece and more homogeneous than Sweden in terms of conventional measures of ethnic heterogeneity, and we span the entire range in between. So my point here again is not that California is typical, it's that California is various, and that variety also means that any inferences from looking at a large population of tax measures at the local level in California at least potentially interesting, at least potentially kind of transposable to other contexts. Population also varies enormously. The largest local government in California is Los Angeles County, which has a greater population than any Scandinavian country. And I think the smallest in my data set is probably Placer County Mosquito Abatement District Zone H7. But I'm not certain. So all of these local governments, if they want to increase a tax, have to give that tax proposal to their voters. And the documentary record here includes things that look like this. Some of you might have lived in California, you might be familiar with the Voter Information Guide, which is typically a book of about 100 pages or more, includes full text of proposed legislation, also includes summaries of arguments for and against that legislation, and something called the impartial analysis prepared by a county or city attorney, the impartiality of which can be litigated. So there's a very strong norm of neutrality here. But here's an example of an impartial analysis for Measure C in the city of Lincoln, construction tax, which tells us lots of things about it: when the collection starts, what the revenue will be used for, what the rate of tax is, how it's determined, and so forth. So sort of these policy summaries get mailed out to voters. And I set out with a team of research assistants and financial help from the Yankelovich Center for Social Science Research, the Spencer Foundation, the National Science Foundation, to collect them all. This is a younger and more innocent me with 2 research assistants and one of those research assistants, young child. That's Lauren Olson, who's now an assistant professor of sociology at Temple, and Jane Lily Lopez and her daughter, Jane is now an associate professor at BYU. And that is the wall chart where we were tracking our progress. Progress here in politely and persistently requesting from local officials in California, could we please have photocopies of the voter information guide, or scans if you have them, of that voter information guide from Measure D in 1988 or whatever, right? So we tried to collect the complete record going back to 1986. We didn't get the complete record. We have an archive of thousands of them, but the archival record here, the archival record of local democracy, is a mess. You know, I believe it was Napa County that had a fire in the county archives, and so there's a lot of things sometime in the 90s, and so there's a lot of measures we couldn't get. There were a lot of them where, you know, the files just weren't kept, and we haven't yet discovered them. So I'm still on the trail. I think we have about a third of all the measures whose existence I can document from state sources that I know somebody voted on a tax. We've got about a third of them, and that's still almost a couple thousand that I'll be talking about here. And here we have a small harvest of, very small relative to the effort, harvest of research papers on the subject. And what I want to do briefly is tell you about some of the things we think we've learned from analyzing these tax measures about what are the characteristics of a tax that people will vote for. Now, I've set this up by talking about taxation in the United States, and I want to say, like, there's one very important limitation on our sort of generalizability here, apart from the obvious ones. A very important limitation on generalizability from this case is that the state constitution does impose some narrow limits on the kinds of taxes local governments can levy in California. They may not levy income taxes. They may not levy property taxes in excess of 1%. And they may not levy estate or inheritance taxes. Within those constraints, however, they can get creative, and they do. We've got measures in the data that are excise taxes on cannabis, parking, ammunition, sugar-sweetened beverages. We've got sales taxes. We've got real estate parcel taxes based on the mere fact of owning real estate, and we've got real estate parcel taxes based on the square footage of your real estate and the land use on your parcel and the number of rental units on your parcel. We've got business license taxes, including business license taxes that are specific to particular kinds of business. We've even got a manufacturing license tax that is levied on gross revenues minus the cost of inputs. In other words, there is a value-added tax in the database. That's Oakland Measure JJ. So an enormous variety of sort of different kinds of taxation happening here within these constraints. Some of the features of those policy features seem to matter more than others, and here are some that I've been able to identify. First, earmarking is popular. Compare earmarked taxes to non-earmarked taxes, and you'll find that the earmarked taxes get a greater share of the vote. This graph is from an analysis of municipal taxes between the years of 1996 and 2010, when we had complete data on all the contextual correlates we wanted. This is the percentage of people approving a municipal parcel tax, comparing those that were not earmarked to those that were earmarked for police, fire, or ambulance services. 11 percentage point difference in the vote. So earmarking is popular, and police, fire, and ambulance especially popular. Earmarking matters. Temporary taxes are popular. This is from a comparative analysis work I did with Dr. Jennifer Nations at UC San Diego on the analysis of school finance and the percentage of people approving a parcel tax for schools, comparing measures that were of indefinite duration to those that would sunset sometime after the next 5 years to those that would sunset within the next 5 years. And the shorter the time frame, the more votes as a share of voters a measure got. Interestingly, related to that, when those taxes came back, voters liked them better than they liked them the first time. So the fact that temporary taxes are popular does not mean that we can't tax long-term. It just means that it appears to mean that voters like it when the authorities come back to them and ask for permission to renew. The comparison here is from work done with Heather Harper, now at the University of New Mexico, and Yenting Xu and Germano Ribeiro at UC San Diego. And the intended comparison here is, imagine you're comparing, for example, would you like to pay sales tax at a rate of 8% or 7%, just to take an example, right? Simple comparison, but it turns out that on average, voters' answer differs if the question is, your tax rate is 8% and it's about to lapse to 7% unless you renew it. Shall we renew 8%? Or Your tax rate is currently 7%. You have a choice between that or raising it to 8%. Shall we raise it to 8%? People are way more likely to say, or a few more percentage points, by more likely, I should say, to say yes when it is renew, even though in both cases the sort of the implied choice is the same. It's between the same two tax rates. Okay, so that's all by way of setup of some initial things I think I've learned from observational analysis, trying to control for observables and doing my best sort of to do the appropriate adjustments. But there's a lot more information we can learn from these impartial analyses. If you just don't need to read this whole wall of text here, but just to highlight some of the kinds of information we have here information, okay, it's a construction tax, it's in the city of Lincoln. We have information about like conditions under which it'll take effect, what it is levied on, exactly when the tax begins, where it will be deposited and what purposes it may be spent for. We've got information about how it exactly would be computed and conditions under which that computation would take place, precisely how certain determinations would be made and when it becomes due and payable. Lots and lots of detailed information, more I think than is captured in these crude comparisons of is it earmarked or not? Is it a direct tax or an indirect tax, right? What's the time frame? So there's a lot more information in the text. And I got interested a few years ago in trying to make the most of all that information. And so I built a workflow. What you can do when you have a giant pile of impartial analyses from California local governments is a lot of different things. But one thing you can do is this. Start by, of course, by identifying them. For that, we used records from the Secretary of State and the California Debt and Investment Advisory Commission. And then collect them. That was us politely and persistently asking local officials, can we please have these? Or going to the library and asking librarians, hey, do you have a copy of the ballot pamphlet from this year? Scan them. A lot of these were old documents we had to scan to PDF. And then, of course, we had to convert them from PDF to some kind of machine-readable format. I ended up using Amazon Text Edit and fed the output to Claude Sonnet 4.5, which one of its uses, it turns out, is as turbocharged spell check. I have found so far, and I have randomly sampled the data, I found 0 errors except it missed one M dash. It does better, in other words, than my human research assistants would do at what would, for my human research assistants, be a very boring task, and I'd rather have them doing sociology. Then I tokenized the data, used the WordPiece tokenizer. This is sort of a product of the Google Labs. It's a conventional part of a natural language processing workflow. Encoded the data with a bidirectional encoder. Here I use GTE large, which takes in large here meaning larger than a sentence, documents, and computes embeddings. I'll talk a bit more about that, but the idea here is to take every token and convert it into a 1024 dimensional vector representation of the word or word piece in a semantic space, in this case contextualized with the meanings of all the other words in that same document. Sample a training set out of that set of documents, run a regression analysis to predict, based on properties of the text, what percentage of people will vote yes, use that to generate some predictions, and then permute the text and see how the prediction changes. If that sounds like a lot of steps, it was. But let me, without dwelling too much on all the details, show you a few things that I think I've learned by doing this. So just a little more detail about my sources here. GTE large, this is an open source large set of weights from a large language model developed by researchers at Alibaba. The regression procedure here I used was ElasticNet. I hope I got the notation there correct with boldface meaning vectors, but the idea here is to minimize not just the sum of the squared deviations from the regression line, but also minimize the sum of the squared regression coefficients and the sum of the a weighted sum of that and the sum of the absolute values of the regression coefficients. That has some very interesting properties. One is that when you have an enormous number of predictors, it shrinks your number of predictors. It sort of selects some of these coefficients to be 0. It also allows you to have, on occasion, even more predictors than you have observations. It also biases all of your coefficients towards 0. So you're paying with known bias for a reduction in variance. That means that none of your coefficients can be interpreted as a causal effect. And in this case, the predictors are abstractions of linguistic patterns that are statistically detectable, but might not actually be sort of obviously or intuitively meaningful as you're reading the text. None of these linguistic patterns varies exogenously. You can't necessarily vary one of them independently of the other aspects of the same text. And the coefficient estimates themselves are biased towards 0 by design. So I just want to say in advance, I'm not going to be showing you coefficient estimates because I have no idea what those coefficient estimates mean. The use of these coefficients here is in prediction. What you can do is predict an outcome and then directly permute the inputs and see how that prediction changes. Okay, some findings. First finding, I was tempted to title this slide, "Don't Fire Your Pollster Yet." These models are not great. They're about as good as a conventional model in political sociology that would include, economic and social and demographic variables like the poverty rate, the per capita income, the percentage of the population that's Black, the percentage of the population that's white or Hispanic. I've built models like that, and those aren't very good predictive models either. So this does about as well as them, but if you are someone who's trying to design a policy and get your voters to support it, or just purely democratically design a policy that you know your voters will support, you will find that this, is not. This is a scatter plot of the actual and predicted vote shares, and you will see, yeah, there's a lot of distance from that 45-degree line there. The R squared in the test set is 22%, and there is a reduction of root mean squared error from about 16 percentage points of the vote to about 14 percentage points of the vote. So that's either a big reduction or an error or a small one, but if I tell an elected official, listen, I've got a model, and on average, it'll get you within like 14, 15% of the number of voters who will support your thing. They will say, that's cute, I want a pollster, please. But we can still learn some things. So I've said the last piece of the workflow is permuting the models, and so let me tell you a little bit about how that works. Simple in principle here. Here's an example of that same impartial analysis by the city of Lincoln. But what I want to know is how each of these components of this text matter, right? Like, how does this part matter? How much does this sort of property of the text matter? How much does this property of the text matter? I don't know exactly what the properties of the text are that the large language model is picking up, but I know a sentence is meaningful. So I'm going to permute it sentence by sentence. And what I'm really interested in is, above and beyond communicating the simple information that this is a tax, what other features in this impartial description are correlated with the vote share. So what I did was I took each measure in the data set, in the test data set, and took each sentence one by one and replaced it with the sentence, this is a tax. Just omit that sentence and replace it with a sentence, this is a tax. Right? And the core intuition here is then you can compute the embeddings, compute the outcome, and so on, given a text that looks like this, and see what each sentence compared to this counterfactual in this model is predicted to yield in terms of vote share, and thereby directly compute effects of the permutation on the prediction. And here's what we learned from doing this for the city of Lincoln. I'm using blue here for sentences that are positively associated with a greater share of the vote, and red for sentences that decrease the share of the vote compared to the raw information that it's a tax. I know red and blue is semiotically overdetermined here, but it's also good for visual accessibility. And I've added the effects here highlighted them in yellow. Simple information, very small effect sentence by sentence, but this one's positive, this one's negative, this one is, that's a very dark blue comparatively, because it is the specific information about when the tax will be collected turns out to have a greater effect than permuting the other sentences in this particular document. So I've gone through all of the taxes that were predicted correctly within 2 percentage points of the vote, and done my best to kind of look at them and interpret them. And so what I'm going to present now is both inductive and interpretive. I'm using this rather abstruse computational method to basically generate texts that you can read and interpret for yourself. And I want to tell you what features popular taxes have. First, they're specific. This one I think we knew. Emergency services are popular. This was Measure R from 1994, Marin County Service Area 27. A sentence that says it's a special tax for paramedic services, plus 9 predicted percentage points of the vote. But the specifics get really specific and they can really matter. And this is where I think the method potentially pays off. This is from a school district measure from 2018 in Millbrae. Notice here, and like many school district measures, they break down the purposes very specifically. So saying this is earmarked for education doesn't even begin to do it justice. It's earmarked for science labs, for strengthening reading and writing programs, attracting and retaining qualified teachers, and so on. And permuting clause by clause here, we get some information about which of these appear to make the biggest difference in the prediction. We can also learn that the specifics matter a lot in context. This is light red here, meaning none of these made a big difference, but these all were negatively associated. That is, they reduced the predicted vote share relative to the counterfactual, where one of these sentences was just, or clauses was just, this is a tax. And what I want you to notice here, without making you try to squint to try to read all of this pink text, but is that this is also from a school district, same county, same decade, also a midterm election. And listing indeed some of the same uses, and yet we see here in the context of other provisions of this policy measure, these particular provisions did not increase the percentage of people predicted to vote for it, presumably because some other features of the Cabrillo Unified School District Measure E did account for the positive vote share here. So the idea is each of these provisions, you could isolate try to isolate an average effect. But I think there is reasonable evidence here that we shouldn't expect the average effects to be the whole story, that even the same provision of a measure in a pretty similar context might have a different effect, depending on what else is going on in the policy. Finally, predictability. This was the biggest surprise to me, and I want to highlight it. This is Big Valley Recreation District, Measure C, 1996. The annual tax would be authorized for an indefinite period beginning with the 1997-98 fiscal year. That increases the share of people who are predicted to vote for this measure. Now, I've already told you that measures with sunset clauses, temporary measures, are popular. And here we are looking at a measure that says, this one's indefinite, and yet that particular feature of it seems to be statistically what is predicted to increase the vote share. Now that is peculiar. Here's another one, interesting. Commencing in 2020, this was a tax on cannabis cultivation from the city of Gonzales. Commencing in 2020, the cultivation tax is subject to an annual adjustment based on the CPI. Again, telling us it's going to change from year to year. It also establishes an initial tax rate and with the ability to raise the rate after 3 years to a maximum of 15% of gross receipts. That also not a big effect at all, but marginally positive. Part of what I take away from this is that what all of these do is provide specific information, specificity about the future. Even if it is, this will begin next year and will continue at this rate indefinitely. When I tell you that, what I am telling you is this isn't going to change. Make this decision. And that's what you get. When I tell you, make this decision and it's going to adjust predictably year after year because of the CPI, up to a cap. There's going to be a cap. We can change the rate, but there's a cap. Right? All of that is stuff that appears to increase the predictability of the tax. And it may be that some of the effect of the sunset provisions is basically, that we detected in our earlier research, is partly about people's wanting some, I guess, management of the risk of future tax increases, which all of these different ways of managing the future-oriented prediction accomplish in one way or another. So I think I'm learning that the taxes we vote for, at least in California, at least in this period, at least in this sample, are specific. They are context appropriate, meaning they have some features that may be favored by voters in the context of other features of the same measure, but that might not matter in combination with a different set of features. And they are predictable in the sense that we appear to favor taxes that specifically give information about how we can anticipate them to be in the future. And yet, of course, it remains unpredictable what we will vote for. And I think if you only take one thing away from this presentation, and that is that very detailed information about the textual features of a policy provides us with a very poor prediction of the percentage of people who will vote for it. That also is not a wrong takeaway message here. What I want to conclude with then is an observation that I think this is bitter, in a way, bitter news for social science, and especially for those of us kind of in that institutionalist vein who were thinking like there's definitely something about the income tax that explains it. There's definitely something about the Social Security payroll tax that explains why that one's more popular than this one. I have been looking at hundreds and hundreds of taxes in California, and I haven't found exactly there's something yet. And a lot of what I found is sort of this negative idea that actually context matters, and when tax features matter, they matter in context in the sense that it matters what other tax features they're in combination with. And that there's a lot of residual variation around any prediction. That's a story about a failure of prediction and the failure of theoretical models to give us or statistical models, to give us any very specific predictions about the future. That's a bummer for social science, but I think it's maybe not bad news for democracy. I think the idea here that there is randomness in politics, I think can be understood not just as a failure of the model. I'm sure we can improve our predictions, but I think it might also actually be a real feature of the world that we're trying to model. That is, there is an enormous amount of randomness in political and policy processes. And part of what that might mean in this context is if you have a favorite way you would wish to transform our tax system, part of what matters, part of the answer to who wins the lottery is it's usually the person who also bought a lot of losing lottery tickets, right? That is, maybe there's sufficient randomness here to think that persistence might actually be among the more important political variables in determining which tax programs get instituted into law and which ones don't. That is at least, I hope, a partly hopeful message to take away from this presentation. And with that, I will say, happy April 15th. And I'll take questions.
I'll take the first question. I think this is super, super interesting. So as two questions. One is like, do you think that you would get greater predictive validity of your model if you're including kind of like more external variables on like the socio-demographic composition of these cities or communities? And how would that kind of like affect the story that we're getting that like we can't really understand that much of what's determining whether these taxes pass or not? The second question is it kind of like, it's another sort of upshot from what you're saying that like people who are caring about tax policy design, like we really shouldn't worry about that so much at all if like a lot of this is randomness and we're seeing that we can have some like significant effects just based on, we should really be focusing on framing effects more than design effects.
So with respect to the first one, my answer is I think we would get a marginal improvement, but not much, because part of, and there is an example of this in a paper I wrote with Heather Harper, published in Socius in 2022, without using embeddings. So this was very, very simple sort of bag of words modeling these documents. But for cities, so we could, and for a defined period where we had great data on all the correlates you would want in such a model, right? Contextual stuff. Income, race, partisanship, features of the local electorate. The basic finding there was a model with only those demographic features and a model with only the text features did about as well as each other predictive-wise, and neither one improved the other one by more than a tiny fraction of percent, which suggests to me that some of this information is basically redundant statistically, in the sense that like different places with different features are proposing different taxes, and so statistically, controlling for one doesn't get us more leverage on the other. The second question, I am also quite skeptical that framing effects get us very far. I think the story here is, sort of the pragmatic takeaway might be, go for good tax policy. Whether or not you think the voters like it, make your best argument, and don't try to manipulate people. They're unpredictable. But like the good tax policy sometimes wins and sometimes loses. And we actually don't have good models of why, so you might as well go for good tax policy. Whatever your normative guideline is there, whether your North Star is like equity or efficiency or whatever it is. Yeah.
This was amazing. So interesting. I want to, instead of pushing on the sort of models, push on the conclusion.
Yes.
And your point that maybe this is good for democracy. So let me articulate what I heard, make sure I got it right. What I'm hearing from you is that our theoretical and statistical models aren't great at explaining and predicting outcomes, that the world is more random than we're able to make sense of. And you concluded maybe that's good for democracy, because then the sort of answer to, or the sort of solution to getting the preferred tax that you might want, or that we collectively think is the right kinds of taxes that should be out there, is not about just sort of tweaking something right, or sort of sneaking something in, or tricking voters, but rather this persistence that sort of, you got to buy a lot of losing tickets to get a winning ticket. So my concern with that would be that, great, but who has the resources to keep pushing and proposing over and over and over again, and losing and keeping it going? That to me doesn't sound awesome. That sounds like there's a big cost and a lot of resources that it would take to sort of push that persistence. So I guess, I don't know, that was my reaction to what you're saying, but I feel like you just sort of dangle that out there and then you have more thoughts on. And so I just generally want to hear more thoughts.
I'm fully taking this like an imminent let me hold for it. But no,
Yeah.
So obviously that doesn't, it's super convenient to be like, well, I got a model, R squared is really low. So let me explain to you why that's possible, because randomness is actually right, very self-serving kind of account. But this does come from somewhere more than just this paper. And so let me point to sort of two different contextual things to kind of make a little more sense of why I think it's useful to make that argument at this point. One is the background here, my kind of memoir through all of this has been the work of Harold Walensky, who made this argument about painfully visible taxes being bad. And his argument was like, listen, if you don't want to hand over your welfare state to the Howard Jarvises of the world, to people who are just going to try to, populist anti-government folks who are just going to try to wreck it, the thing to do is to make your tax system invisible. And first of all, and so empirically, I think that's wrong. But I wasn't, I was interested to discover whether it was right or wrong. But I found it very troubling. So I guess I'm not, although I wish I had a more definite answer, I'm not troubled to find that hiding the ball isn't the way to the path to good government, right? Because that's one way to kind of read that line of argument, is to say, well, this is an argument for actually just leave the technocrats in charge. Do stuff that, that conceals from people, build a submerged state on purpose and submerge it. And there's something about that kind of rubs against my democratic values. The second place this comes from is having, begun my journey into studying taxation with really a comparative historical study of tax revolts, and particularly the rebellions against the property tax in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. One of the ways in which I read their history is that Proposition 13, that really transformed California's tax system, didn't come out of nowhere. Howard Jarvis tried to abolish the income tax, the property tax in 1968. He tried to ran a grassroots campaign to limit the property tax in 1972. I believe there's another one in 1973 and maybe another one in 1976. 1978, he finally hit the jackpot, right? And he was learning the whole time, tweaking his policy proposals to this one really angered that constituency. I wonder if I adjust it this way, will that make a difference? But so it wasn't as if it was pure pure random, like pull the lever on the slot machine each time. There was some learning happening. But also part of how I think about that history of what moved California tax politics in a direction that I don't think is great, is the story about somebody with a bad idea who persisted. And the last thing I'll end here is, I guess, also about the history of the progressive income tax, which I rather like. We didn't get it the first time, and we didn't get it the second time. And in fact, some people campaigned for that for decades to make that happen. And I think that's important history to remember also.
Thank you so much for this talk. I learned a ton and find it really fascinating. I want to kind of pick up on something I think you mentioned in this response to Jeremy's question, which is thinking about like the longitudinal nature of your data and whether or not you've looked at that at all. I mean, just some questions off the top of my head that I'd be really interested in knowing is like, how have the type of taxes that are getting proposed changed over time? How have popularity of certain features changed over time? And also something maybe about the sequence of, like, I was wondering whether kind of on this point of like somebody with a bad idea being persistent or maybe a tax getting a certain type of tax like getting introduced and then that tax becoming something that voters are used to or are more accepting of. So I was wondering if you looked at any of those questions.
Only the one of like, you know, the same tax gets put forward once and then passes and then gets put forward again. And we've tried to like really quantify, does that in fact, and it's, yeah, there does appear to be an increase in sharing people like it the second time. Some of the other temporal questions here I love. So I have not tried interacting policy features with time to see which ones have grown descriptively, which ones have grown more or less popular over time. I think that's a very interesting line of research to pursue here. There is enough information in the archive to also identify some of the actors involved in at least some of these. So many of these, you know, ballot pamphlets have arguments in favor and arguments against, which are submitted to the county clerk and packaged with that ballot pamphlet and distributed, and they're signed. And so you can identify here the relevant interest groups or the relevant elected officials. And we haven't done that yet, except in very sort of broad terms. Our first cut at this, looking at the municipal data for the first period, we found that what I think of as a Nixon goes to China effect, where basically if the business groups are for a tax increase, it's more likely to pass. But if they oppose a tax increase, that makes no difference because that's kind of the default expectation, I think. But I think that might be another really interesting way to get it, like basically, you know, maybe chaining some of these particular things to be like, okay, let's identify all the ones that were pursued by the same, introduced by the same elected official or pursued by the same interest group over time in the same city. We could actually, in principle, do that with some of this. The matching would be a computational nightmare, but doable in principle. Yeah.
I also want to push on the interpretation, but kind of in context of the model. So I really appreciated what you said about that you're not doing inference, you're doing prediction, right? And that's the nature of the models. But I sort of wonder if when we change from inference to prediction, like prediction is kind of always terrible, right? I'm thinking about the like Salganic et al. Big picture, where it's like, it turns out to be really hard to predict anything. Exactly. Yeah. And so I'm wondering, like, in a world where you had done something in an inferential framework and we saw like, oh, there's this like 4 percentage point effect or something like that, we might say, well, that seems kind of big, right? So I'm wondering if going from like a average marginal effect world to like a R squared world just makes us more pessimistic.
Yeah. Maybe. Right. I mean, it's maybe, and I think that, you know, I'm obviously playing with the tools, right? There's a sense in which like this thing of being like, I'm just going to commute it sentence by sentence and be like, this is attack, like that, you know, I cannot point to authority that says this is a good method. I can point to authority that says this is a thing you can do. Maybe you learn something.
Your statement like that the models aren't very good.
Yeah, I guess here's why I think that's reasonable, a reasonable claim to make. If what you want out of a model is practical guidance, and part of what you're doing is trying to put a tool in the hands of decision makers. Those decision makers could be elected officials in California, they could be voters. Like, part of what my motive is here is like, let me tell the California voters, listen, you all, here's what you and your neighbors seem to go for, so you can stop wasting as much time posing things that you won't actually like. The stability, the out of sample prediction is gained, matters a lot. So you might be right that it makes us more pessimistic. And it may be that I just have a tragic view of the world. That I get more pessimistic and I'm like, yeah, this feels real.
So I'm wondering whether these three favorable attributes have some like internal hierarchy or they're just like three parallel attributes, or which one is more important than the other two? Because I think the context appropriate is based on the context, but the context is based on the other factors. So yeah, I'm wondering that whether we have like the hierarchy between or the parallel.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think one of the ways to get it, like, if it appears productive to sort of continue with this particular mode of analyzing the data, right? Like using document embeddings and then permuting document features. One of the ways to get at that might be to basically create a hierarchy of permutation instead of permuting it sentence-wise. Right? Start to think about, okay, let me permute a paragraph or whatever the unit is, right? At a certain point, I might just back into, once again, doing qualitative coding, being like, okay, actually what I'm doing is just saying it's an earmarked or not. So that's just to say, great question. I don't know. I think it's very plausible that there is a hierarchy. I don't know what it is. Yeah, and maybe a turn from this kind of inductive, naive sentence level approach to the data back to like, okay, let me test some hypotheses might actually be, at this point, the move to get at that. Yeah,
thanks so much for a very interesting talk. I'm curious, but do you have any sense the proposals put forward that would just have be a tax on it? Like a single business or 2 or 3 businesses that are very specific in the definition, would therefore almost all voters would not be burdened themselves, and describing that as describing the burden essentially in the tax would change if it's voted for or not. And then the second point I was interested if you thinking about giving us more information about these text base here is that, like, do people actually read it? And if not, would you expect that your predictions would be better if you do the very same sentence by sentence analysis in, let's say, the descriptions in the media of that?
Yeah. Let me take the second one first. I think we know that most people don't read it. But we also, and my assumption is not, again, that the impartial analysis itself is sort of causing effects directly through, impartial analysis hits a voter's eyeballs, affects their behavior. My assumption is impartial analysis, pretty good description of actually legally relevant features of the proposal, affects behavior of elected officials and interest groups who then wage campaigns. And so I do think the framing effects are downstream from something that's in the policy. And so that was part of the hunch here, was like manipulate the policy, because regardless of whether, there's limits on how far you can go with framing effects alone. But yeah, stuff that is more proximate to voters' information might in fact be more predictive. And it may be that part of what I'm finding here is that the fine details get lost. right? And this connects to the earlier point about a hierarchy, right? That like, yeah, if I commute it sentence by sentence, I don't find anything that anyone cares about. If I commute it in some much more global way, holistically, it's the package that matters in some way. Second question, I don't know. I do know there are examples in the data. I don't know how many of them, but I can think of at least one. I think it was a local government in Santa Barbara County where there was, the typical way it works is that it's sort of a general tax, but then there's a category within it that really, it's like, we've changed our business license tax to also include a special category for waste management businesses. There's one waste management business that operates in this town. There's a number like that, of them like that. The excise tax on gun and ammunition sales in Oakland, I think, was targeted at just one or two businesses. So these things exist. Good question. Yeah.
So if you have these impartial ones, I assume you also have the pro and the con side. And have you considered analyses of these? I'm especially thinking of if you're sort of interested in saying that, you know, it's actually not framing, it's not the content, it's what's happening with the interest groups on either side. You could sort of capture narrative more easily in those pro and con things, and you can make an argument there about.
That has been on the to-do list. Yes, love that idea. Here's the challenge. Most of these measures, actually nobody submits arguments for or against. And so we have a much smaller data set we're working with when it comes to that. I think at the moment, that is absolutely sort of where I want to go. One place I want to go with this. I think one of the ways in which I am assessing this research program right now is that I think the greatest return on investment of research time is actually on growing the data set. I think I just need more taxes. Yes.
Yeah, so actually I had a question like exactly on like data gathering.
Yeah.
I'm like, are there like not like just randos that like love to collect these like things that come in the mail? Cause like, yeah, well I'm saying like, I don't know if like maybe historical archives and different of like, or historical societies of like different California counties, or if like, they're just like going on like some subreddit and like, I did this for Bob Dylan concerts, for example, like there's people that collect this stuff. And so, yeah, I'm just wondering if like there's any like non-administrative government source that you might actually be.
Yeah, so I actually want to first of all acknowledge Professor Rod Kiwi of Caltech, who had been doing a project on school parcel taxes. And at a certain point, I think it was Jane on my research team reached out to a county clerk who was like, we just had a professor asking. And we got in touch with Rod and he shared the box he'd already collected, right? And it's like that saved us some time. Really, really wonderful, wonderful colleague, very generous. But yes, we actually had a hierarchy in the original data collection scheme, begin with the agency itself. If they don't have it, go to the county clerk because the county administers the elections. See if the county has it, go to the county archives. If they don't have it, try the public library. If they don't have it, put an ad in the penny saver. We never got to that last stage, partly because it took so long that by then there was another year of data to collect, and it was easier to like email the LA County clerk again, right? And the LA County clerk, by the way, my favorite official office in all of local government in California, Los Angeles County, is great at public records requests. But yes, a wonderful idea, and eventually, yes.
Thank you for the great talk. I want to go back to the model and specifically what you started with relatively early on.
Yeah.
Where you said that a large majority of the proposals pass. And I wonder if that sort of that brings up two implications for me. One is that the counterfactual that you're modeling is basically not in the data. So it's when you say this is a tax, where does the prediction learn the effect from any other document if that's never in the document? If never in the other documents. So that's the sort of modeling thing. But then I wonder also if it's a more substantive implication too, which is that maybe it shouldn't be the taxes we vote for, but the taxes we propose. In the sense that once it's proposed, it's basically random. If you believe the model is true. Well, then real importance is like, why do certain kinds of policies get proposed in the first place?
Yeah.
What do you think?
That's a really good point. And so maybe part of the reason that the selection is why it's not predicting well. As for the learning, it's complicated. Yeah, I'm not sure this is a tax in exactly that terms. It appears anywhere in any of these. So I could take a sentence from one of them that does appear, right, and use that as the baseline for permutation, or I could just do what's done, you know, what the Alibaba team did in training these models, the Google team training these models, which is just have like a blank token and just insert a kind of a blank sentence in there somehow and try that. Worth doing. I think to clarify though, I am using encoders that were trained on a gigantic corpus, right? So these are pre-trained models. So I'm not training the weights based on this corpus. And so part of what that means is like semantic similarities among things here are like, you know, tax has certain meanings related to other things, and that's well represented here if it's well represented in the internet and the other, you know, and the copyrighted information that they stole and all the other read in this model. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Unite with everyone else that's saying this is a really great talk. I kind of want to build a little bit on Niels's Niels's question here, and thinking about sort of proposed versus voted on and sort of voted for. Thinking about voter turnout.
Yes.
And like, you able to, right? Because I mean, you obviously collect these over all the different elections, and there's going to be more or less voter turnout across different things.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if some of this randomness is just like, who knows what 20% of the population will say if they come out and vote, and that population is really bizarre in all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about how you think voter turnout shapes the prediction question, but then also shapes sort of your understanding and interpretation of the value of framing or these different pieces.
Yeah. Good question. I do think, so I've not modeled it systematically. I have in some earlier models where I wasn't doing the, you know, word embeddings. Did like basically year fixed effects to say, okay, let's control for the difference between, you know, presidential election year, congressional election year, and an off year, completely off year special election kind of situation. So holding that, you know, the findings about earmarking and so on from early in the talk, that's from models that did that. There is the capacity, so the California state data sources here are interesting. The state election data archive, I can actually compute the number of people who voted. I have information about the total number of votes in all the elections in this graph. A bunch of the data, however, that I used also comes from elections that didn't show up in this graph, but that I knew about because the California Debt and Investment Advisory Commission collects its own data series of local tax measures, and it turns out they notice different ones, and they don't have information about turnout. So limited information. Do think it matters, and I guess I'm going to offer an impression, and this you could call this like Isaac's vague impression, or you could call it a hypothesis he hasn't tested yet, which is interestingly, I think earlier in this period, I suspect that, and let me see if I think this is true. I believe that we see on-year elections, yeah, like 2000, right? Comparatively low passage rate. 2000, I think that's 2004, comparatively low passage. So I'm going to say actually not a comparison for time. I'm going to say the hunch is that oddly the off-year elections may have higher passage rates, lower turnout here may be associated with higher passage, which is not what one might expect or not what I would have expected, but might have something to do again with kind of strategic calculations made by officials who kind of are timing things to get the electorate they want. Yeah.
Just on that last point, like, yeah, that would, I think, correspond with like some Jeri-Ann's work in political science. Like, yeah, these off-cycle elections, like these interest groups can kind of get the.
So if you're coming away from this being like, that was interesting, but I'm not sure I learned any specific information about how to write a tax that people will say yes to, welcome to my world. But I do think, I guess the the biggest picture idea I want to leave us with is if you read something in the comparative literature that suggests to you that someone has figured out the institutionalist theory, the silver bullet, all you gotta do is get it back. And then people will like taxes and you won't have these, or, right, this kind of tax definitely winner, you just gotta do this. I hope you come away from this talk a little less certain that any of those people know what they're talking to you.